Hey everyone, welcome to The Field Between. My name is Ahmed.
And I'm Yasmin.
And today we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Hossam El Hamalawy, a revolutionary socialist and journalist. You can find his work on Middle East Eye and his Substack, Arabawi, where he provides commentary on Egypt's military, security services, foreign policy, and local dissent. Welcome to the podcast, Hossam.
Hi, Ahmed and Yasmin. Thanks a lot for having me over.
No, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
Absolutely. And there's so much that we can talk about. The way that I kind of became familiar with you is again through your work in Middle East Eye and more recently through the Substack that you've been publishing. And you wrote this really excellent kind of overview more recently about what looms over the horizon for Egypt in 2025. I think it's called the Egypt Security Sector Report. And I want to go through that today and kind of just talk at a high level about what are the things that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and then Egyptians more generally can kind of come to expect for the country in 2025. But before we get to that, I think it's worth spending a few minutes on an overview of what it's been like in Egypt since the 2011 uprising. I know it's kind of fair for me to ask you to summarize 14 years worth of history in just a few minutes, but maybe we can start there so we can get an understanding of what's been happening over the last decade.
Sure. We are approaching the anniversary of the revolution. So just a quick recap for your audience who might not have been following news on Egypt. Egyptians took to the streets in January 2011 in an 18-day uprising against the US-backed autocrat Hosni Mubarak, who had ruled Egypt for roughly 3 decades. And he was in the process of grooming his son also for succession. The uprising, although definitely it was inspired by regional events, namely the revolution in Tunisia, but it was also the product of a long process of dissent accumulation in the country that had started in the year 2000, to be more specific, with the outbreak of the solidarity protests with the Second Palestinian Intifada. Most of the turning points in the history of dissent in Egypt is either directly or indirectly the product of solidarity with the Palestinians or the Palestinian cause factors in somehow. When the protests broke out in the year 2000, this was a rock in the thrown in the still waters, because in the previous decade, street politics had died in Egypt, thanks to our first war on terror that was declared by Hosni Mubarak, allegedly targeting Islamist militants, but the scope of the crackdown went basically to target all shades of dissent in the country. These protests triggered a long process of dissent where it started by solidarity protests with regional causes, namely Palestine and the war in Iraq. But then the pro-Palestine and the anti-Iraq war movement evolved into Kifaya, which is Arabic for enough. And Kifaya was launched by the end of 2004 by the same people who were at the front or who were leading the pro-Palestine and the anti-Iraq war movements. And Kifaya started mobilizing in the streets, destroying Hosni Mubarak's taboo. But definitely we didn't succeed in toppling him, which was, definitely our declared aim.
I gotta
But
ask,
Kifaya electrified the country,
yeah.
and in a way, it inspired the working class or it created a culture of protest in the country in which the working class started their mass strikes by the end of 2006. And these mass strikes turned into the longest and the most sustained wave of strike action in the history of Egypt since 1946. Literally, Ahmed, all sectors in society were going on strike,
Mm.
uh, probably except the army and the police at the time. And this is the context through which the uprising took place in January 2011. And I always stress these preconditions because usually the narrative around the uprising in Egypt and in the rest of the region usually revolves around social media, Facebook, Twitter, how Egyptians suddenly, took to the streets after a Facebook event. But, things are much more complicated than that. During the 18 days, we held out in Tahrir and in other protest squares at the time. But it was only during the last week of the uprising when Tahrir was taken to the factories and the mass strikes started once again in the workplaces and in the government offices. That's when the military junta in Egypt, represented by the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces, which we dub SCAF, the generals were basically forced to get rid of Hosni Mubarak, or else the whole regime could have collapsed. Now, definitely the suspension of the protests in Tahrir gave the army some breathing space, but the army had been conspiring in order to defuse the revolution and to crush it and to protect the order um, in which the army generals were part of, and they were also part of the ruling elites. Now, in 2013, the army launched a coup led by then Minister Abdel Fattah, Defense Minister Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And this coup, I mean, it was a classic military coup, but it did enjoy initially large support among sections of the population. Why did sections of the population initially support the coup? I mean, on the one hand, the Egyptian middle class and some other sections of society were tired of the instability, whereby the revolutionary forces could not settle basically the revolution. I mean, the revolution is like a boxing match or a war or some form of a conflict that if you don't manage to settle as swiftly as possible, usually, the audience or even the participants in some cases, they start feeling weary, they start feeling exhausted. And some sections of the population, namely the Egyptian middle class, wanted a return to stability. Um, and then there were other social groups that had legitimate grievances against the Muslim Brotherhood rule at the time. Whether it was the Egyptian Coptic minority, whether it was women groups, and other social groups in society. But this initial support for Abdel Fattah Sisi, which, when you think about it, it's as close as the kind of support that, for example, Nasser had after 1956 war. I mean, it was massive at the time. Sisi had so much clout in society. And he also played with people's dreams. He used to give all of those rosy statements about Egypt, هتبقى قد الدنيا, Egypt will be like, a superpower, a great country. Egyptians have been mistreated for a very long time. Now it's time for prosperity, blah, 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 blah. I mean, there were all sorts of statements that you can go back and watch in time. um, and it is such a stark, I mean, contrast from what we are today. The kind of regime that evolved out of the military coup of 2013 was not simply a restoration of the old Mubarak's order or Mubarak's old authoritarian formula. Instead, it was a new kind of repressive regime that we had not seen in our history. I mean, some people always like to give the example of Nasser, as a military ruler who squashed dissent. But Sisi's regime is different. And it's different not only in terms of the high level of carceral and lethal repression, but also in the fact that we don't have political institutions in the country any longer. What we have is the repressive state apparatus represented by the military, the police, and the security services, cannibalizing the rest of the state organs and ruling, presiding over society without any sort of buffers, without a proper ruling political party, for example, without any functioning civilian institutions, without dissenting NGOs. Even apolitical charities were dismantled after the military coup. Sisi rules the country with a cabal of officers. They are not accountable in any sense. They do not have any opposition of any kind. They have all been dismantled. And this is the sad reality of roughly a decade after the revolution and the counter-revolution that Egypt had witnessed. But since you're living in the US, it's also important to highlight that this regime could not have survived that long without the US and the Western backing.
Definitely.
This regime had lost its legitimacy domestically. This regime does not enjoy any any broad class alliance support in our society. This regime is being bailed out, floated, armed by the US, the EU, and other international players who simply are, I mean, have decided to play it safe. All they want is regional stability, even if it was stability on the expense of human rights. They want someone who would stop all of those brown and black people crossing the Mediterranean into the white shores of Europe. They want someone who would keep on squeezing the Palestinians for concessions. And Abdel Fattah Sisi is playing that role. And this is the kind of regime that's ruling Egypt today.
Yeah, thank you for that incredible summary. So there, like you kind of hinted at, there are a lot of geopolitical, situations and tensions on Egypt's border, especially with the complicity and kind of managing Israel's genocide in Palestine, which and also on the southern border and the western. But before we get to those a little bit more deeply, could you talk a little bit about, starting from within Egypt, what are and what have been Sisi's economic policies? To what extent was that inherited from Mubarak? And what has been the effect on the working class going into 2025?
Sisi's policies, although they definitely include austerity policies that are very reminiscent of what Hosni Mubarak was doing, but overall he has a completely different approach to how to manage or to be more accurate, mismanage the Egyptian economy. Under Hosni Mubarak, Mubarak was overseeing a transition from a mainly state-led economy, which got diversified a little bit under Sadat. So, I guess the proper term to label Egypt's economy before 1991 as a mixed economy, where the public sector and the state were producing, or they basically were generating big chunks of the Egyptian GDP. But simultaneously, there was a rising private sector in Egypt by businessmen who were also linked to the state at the end of the day. They were the sons of the former army and Mukhabarat generals. They were people who were married into the state bureaucracy, married to daughters or sons of senior state officials. And through their connections, you had a kind of crony capitalism that evolved in Egypt after 1991. I'm saying 1991 to be more specific because this was the year when Mubarak announced the ERSAP, the Economic Reform and Structural Adjustment Program, which was our neoliberal transition program sponsored by the IMF and the World Bank and blessed also by the United States, who had just dropped Egypt's military debt in exchange for the Egyptians sending their troops to take part in the Gulf War against Iraq at the time. And Mubarak started the privatization program. Interestingly, Ahmed, within the same year that he declared the war on terror. And we always have to think about the lineage between the two, because this is not just an Egyptian phenomena, but that's also international. You find it in so many other countries where austerity policies are coupled with domestic wars, whether it's war on terror, war on crime, war on drugs, war on illegal migration, and what have you. Because it suits well the regime's interests or the government's interests at the time. You privatize, you make the state withdraw from the social sphere, you cut social services, but hand in hand, you militarize the police, you securitize society, and if any form of dissent breaks out because of your austerity policies, you can crack down on them immediately in the name of fighting terror, fighting drugs, fighting crime, or fighting whatever.
Yeah, it's the perfect position to be in because it gives you some degree of abstraction from kind of the looting that's going on and what the
Exactly.
private sector is doing, but at the same time, you just kind of fulfill your duty as a protector of the capital there. So,
I can also
Exactly.
imagine it
Yeah.
makes you
And
more.
you saw this in the US after 9/11. The austerity policies that were enacted by the US after 9/11, it went hand in hand with the militarization of your police, with the war on terror, domestically and abroad. So it's not just an Egyptian phenomenon.
And actually, a quick
By
question: does the
Yeah.
framing of the war on terror in Egypt, was that also meant to kind of appeal to an American kind of foreign policy to get like more investment?
Remember, this is a decade before 9/11. So, your point is definitely valid after 9/11, where the Egyptian security services, presented themselves to the Americans as close allies who can help with the intelligence war against the Arab Afghans. against Al-Qaeda. The Egyptian interrogators were seen in Guantanamo, and the US used to send prisoners to get tortured and interrogated in Egypt in what was dubbed the Extraordinary Renditions Program. But when the Egyptians started their own war on terror in 1991, I mean, partially it was, responding to international trends, but I would say that the reasons were mainly domestic. Um, Mubarak had to go on the attack as he enacted his austerity policies, and the regime had worries about the rising tide in Islamist militancy and exploited the opportunity to crack down on dissent from all shades at the time. So, by even when the so-called terror threat was more or less crushed by the end of the 1990s, Hosni Mubarak's notorious and infamous and the longest serving interior minister in our modern history, Major General Habib al-Adli, continued the war on terror policies all the way up to 2011. Um, I grew up in Egypt. I lived most of my life in Egypt, and I remember what Egypt used to be like in the 1990s when I was a teenager, or later in the 2000s. I always felt, Yasmin, that I was under occupation. There were police armored vehicles in most of the public squares, machine guns and soldiers, looking and gazing into the passerbys. There were checkpoints that you had to pass by, and with every checkpoint, you would get really nervous because they can randomly target you. There were extrajudicial killings that were happening in Egypt, especially in the 1990s. Torture was endemic, and it didn't just target alleged terror suspects or political dissidents, but ordinary Egyptians who are remotely connected to dissent of any kind were also victims. But hand in hand with this, going back to what you were asking me about the economic policies, this was coupled with the rise of our neoliberal elites who gathered around Gamal Mubarak, the son of the president, and they took over the so-called National Democratic Party Policies Secretariat or Policies Committee. This was a powerful committee created by Hosni Mubarak sometime in the 2000s. I can't remember now if it was 2002 or 2004, because these were the 2 years when Gamal Mubarak, suddenly made his dashing entrance into politics in Egypt. And these neoliberal businessmen, they were like um, a central partner in the ruling coalition in Egypt. And I'm stressing this because this didn't become the case after the 2013 military coup. After 2013, when Sisi started building his own regime, this was coupled by what scholar Yazid Sayegh, who I do definitely recommend his work to your listeners, because he's done really so much good work on the Egyptian army's business empire. The kind of policies that Egypt or the Egyptian regime followed at the time was a militarized form of state capitalism, where the regime embarked on mega projects that were allocated to the army and its corporations Maybe I should also explain this to your listeners if they are not familiar with Egypt, that increasingly since the 1980s, the Egyptian army was intervening in the local economy. Uh, After Egypt signed the peace treaty with the Israelis in 1979, and then Sadat was shot 2 years later, Hosni Mubarak wanted to get the army out of politics to an extent because he always feared the threat of a military coup and wanted to basically bribe the army into supporting him, in addition to giving the army a new role instead of war making. Um, so the kind of compromise that he came up with was to allow the army to operate in the civilian economy. But there is a catch here. I mean, the army was not really a fair competitor, if I can call it that way. The army corporations are exempted from taxes. They are exempted from tariffs, and being part of the state apparatus, if not, I mean, the strongest part in the state apparatus, this means that when you partner with the army, you're guaranteed competitive advantages that are not available for others. I mean, I call it the permits economy. Um, in Egypt, in order to do anything, I mean, even to breathe, you have to get a permit. And usually, I mean, this permit, I mean, involves a wide array of government institutions, but mostly they are the army and different branches within the army. So, for example, if you are some investor and you want to build a resort on the Red Sea, you have to get I mean, a long list of permits, but the most important ones are from the Border Guard Intelligence Service, from the Army Armed, it's called what? The Armed Forces Operations Command, and three or four other, I mean, branches from the army. And this is not just to build a resort. If you build a resort, but let's say that you want to create a jetty or build a kiosk facing the sea in order to sell like beverages, you have to get a permit from the army. So I call it the permits economy because I mean the army is like it's like, it's like a goose, that's like laying golden eggs for the regime without doing anything. It's just parasitic.
It's kind of, I mean, just I didn't grow up in Egypt like you did. My family left when I was 5, and Yasmin and I actually returned. It was my first time in 27 years last summer. So, and one of the things that we were just absolutely, even kind of knowing a little bit about Egypt, one of the things we were still shocked by is just the degree to which the military and the police are the face of everyday life in Egypt, right? So just trying to get into a tourist location or even to a hotel or just walking around, we even tried to go to Tahrir just to kind of see the square, expecting there to be some level of activity there where people are going and taking pictures. And it wasn't until we approached it that 6 men just stepped out of the shadows because
Yeah.
it was night, and they were like, no, you can't be here. Their entire, for a country where not a lot of people, where a lot of people are looking for work, they just hired 6 guys whose entire job is to stand there. And then we started to kind of look around and saw like heavily militarized police just around that area, but everything we did required an interaction with either a police officer or a military officer. But like you said, this military economy where it just kind of makes it so that people who are adept at either navigating these arcane systems or at bribery I'm wondering uh, how many of these permits, or to what degree, did this allow capital flight out of the country, right? So I imagine someone who's an outside investor who just has a lot of money to be able to pay their way through it would be at an advantage. Is that fair to say?
I mean, you're right. I think I've read some Reuters report a while ago about this exact problem, where basically investors, I mean, number one, they don't feel secure investing in Egypt because, I mean, the army can show up at any point and take over their business. I mean, and they've did it in a like a mafia style of, shakedowns. And there is no independent judiciary in Egypt. So in a way, this is harmful for capital or international capital because what if the
Mm.
government screws you over? There is no one that can hold them accountable. But for other kind of capitalists, I mean, they see this as an advantage. They see that, okay, I mean, it's not really a problem for me to go into Egypt as long as I partner with some major general in the military. He will protect my investments. Uh, this is, of course, very short-sighted. You cannot sustain this economic model for long. And you can find this in the continuous calls by the international donors, who are definitely, they are neither progressive nor leftists, nor they give a shit about Egyptians in general. But when you find that the IMF and the World Bank, in addition to the regional Gulf backers of Abdel Fattah Sisi, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are asking the Egyptian regime to curb the military's influence in the economy, then you know that something is gravely wrong with what's happening. Now, these backers initially they happily channeled their investments through the military after the coup for political reasons, essentially. I mean, they wanted to support the new regime that was still in the phase of formation. And they felt it was politically appropriate to channel their money through the army projects. But by 2022, to be more specific, that's when the Gulf countries started to really feel infuriated. On the one hand, Sisi had, Alhamdulillah, I mean, for them, like finished off the revolution. Sisi had crushed the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood, who were like the boogeyman or a threat to the Gulf regimes at the time. Um, and they felt that, their investments in Egypt is like washed away by the sea. It's as if, they are pumping in money and this money is evaporating. It's evaporating because of white elephant projects that satisfy Sisi's megalomania, like the new administrative capital. They were frustrated by the army, which they saw as too corrupt, even like too corrupt for beyond the limits that they deem reasonable. And they started to ask for the army first, like, to roll back its influence in the economy. This number one. Number two, they did something really, I mean, it's hilarious, but it's sad at the same time. MBS, Mohammed ibn Salman,
Mhm.
was in Cairo a few months ago. And in order to sign a treaty or like an agreement with Sisi, and the agreement is officially dubbed as اتفاق حماية الاستثمارات السعودية في مصر. The agreement or the treaty for protecting Saudi investments in Egypt, whereby it included clauses that supposedly guarantees protection for Saudi investments from nationalization in case of a war or in case of a revolution. I mean, this is
So
like,
Wow.
in town.
th-
So it just tells you, like, how these guys, I mean, regard their man in Cairo at the end of the day.
Yeah, this reminds me a lot, and I mean, it mirrors a lot of just the same way that, a private equity firm will invest in from the U.S. will invest in like a, poor Latin American country or have some assets there, and then when they nationalize or, something like oil, and then they get sanctioned by the West, and then all these guys go in and just pick the country apart because they feel entitled to the country's assets. So that to me does not seem like it bodes well for Egypt. I do want to go back a little bit and focus on the big projects like the new administrative capital. We had the pleasure of going to some of the new museum, and anytime. I mean, it's just amazing. Anytime you hear anything about it, they're just telling you, "Hey, this is the biggest opera house in the world. This is the biggest museum in the world," and it just seems like something that the Egyptians should be so proud of. But can you talk a little bit about how that is received and how these projects, or the construction of these projects, is being carried out and what effect it's had?
The kind of business model that partially explains these projects is a militarized state capitalist economy that is fueled by mega projects that are financed by foreign debt. Um, that's what Egypt has been doing over the past decade. When Sisi took over, Egypt's foreign debt was roughly, I think, around 40 billion or 41 billion. Now it's over 150 billion. Um, it reached a record by the end of 2023 of 168 billion. Now it's down to something above 150 billion. I'm not sure how much, but I mean, you can easily find this out.
And would that be because Egypt has been paying it back, or is it because they've been getting some debt forgiven in exchange for, I don't know, maybe enforcing the Rafah crossing or anything like that?
That service is definitely eating up government budget on an annual basis, but the the kind of debt that Egypt is embroiled in recently, this is more or less a situation that was created by the Europeans and the Americans and other international backers who have rushed in after the outbreak of the war in Gaza and the ongoing genocide in order to secure the stability of the Egyptian regime. That's I mean, they state this regularly on the record. They have given up on any pretense that they care about human rights. They have given up on any pretense that, we are there in order to protect, the prosperity and blah, 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 and what have you of the Egyptians. They are only talking at this point regime stability. Now, obviously, we know that this is short-sighted because you keep on bailing out a failed regime, which is failed on the level of economics, but also on the level of politics. If foreign support is cut now, this regime will not survive for long. And here you can think of an equivalent in a different situation, but it's still you find striking resemblance is the Syrian regime. I mean, the moment that his international backers basically vanished, this regime collapsed in 4 days. That's it. So what we have in Egypt at the moment are these mega projects, like the ones that you visited. And yeah, I mean, you can find like, very interesting new projects like the Egyptian New Museum. But by the way, this museum had already started under Hosni Mubarak, and it was supposed to be finished by 2009. Um, And I know that because I was a journalist and I interviewed the project director at the time. And, these are the kind of statements that I got. But here we are, 2 or 3 decades later, and, the project is finally done.
Maybe they were trying to get all the permits, you know.
I don't think, they would face issues with the permits, but, definitely they would face issues with corruption, with the misallocation of budget and what have you. But then you have the new administrative capital. Um, Part of it can be explained by Sisi's megalomania. Um, if Nasser had the high dam, Sadat had the October 73 war, Mubarak, I'm not sure really what Mubarak had, but Sisi wants to go down in history as he believes he's the savior of Egypt. He believes that, he speaks to God and God, like, speaks back to him. And I'm saying this because we have to understand the mentality of this guy.
Mhm.
Hosni Mubarak was pragmatic. He was an autocrat. I mean, he was a killer. I have zero respect for Hosni Mubarak. But Hosni Mubarak was a pragmatic bureaucrat. Uh, he knew that he was a thief. He knew that he was there in order to enrich himself. He didn't have an ideology. He was just there. Sisi believes that he's got sent. And it's those kind of autocrats that you usually have to fear more than your normal average, autocrat. And I can't believe that I'm saying that. And so, anyways, like, this drive towards the mega projects at the new administrative capital, part of it is megalomania. The other part is security, because Sisi has a paranoia when it comes to popular unrest. Um, he doesn't make a secret out of this. In almost every speech that he gives, there is always a reference to 2011, the crisis of 2011, the catastrophe of 2011, the conspiracy of 2011.
Yeah.
He
I saw
even
the
went,
I
yeah,
saw he put out a very manicured video after the Syrian uh revolt like recently, that was just like, hey, don't let them do the don't let them do what they did in Syria to here. I don't know if you saw that video.
yeah. He met his publicists at the so-called strategic headquarters or strategic command headquarters, which is located at the Octagon. I mean, if the Americans have Pentagon, we have the Octagon. It's part of also their inferiority complex. They must have, like, the biggest, I
It's
don't know, the tallest tower in Africa, the biggest, I
it's
don't know
got
what.
40% more sides.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, for them, like, apparently, like, size is all what
Yeah.
matters at the end of the day. So he met with the senior command of the army, of the police, of the intelligence service, and then he met with his publicists, and he told them that, my hands are not stained with anyone's blood. I never stole anyone's money, which is these bizarre statements that just tells you, how worried and how scared he is.
Yeah.
But Ahmed, I mean, he already had previously, like on the record in public events, statements where he asked the media industry and the journalists to create a phobia regarding the collapse of the state among the people. I mean, he said that.
Mm.
أنا عايزكم تعملوا فوبيا إسقاط الدولة عند المصريين,
Like an
Um,
actual pathology. Just
yeah, so part of why he went and to create this new capital is that it cannot be brought to a standstill if a revolution breaks out. I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere. It has all of his senior brass surrounding him. It is highly digitized, highly surveyed. Like the moment you step inside, there will be, according to Major General Ahmed Zaki Abdin, the former director of um, of the new administrative capital. He's been changed recently, but he said that there will be at least 28,000 CCTV cameras scattered along all corners and all streets of the new administrative capital, whereby he can lock himself in together with his senior brass and basically conduct the war against the zombies, outside
Mm.
on his walls. So this is another reason, but there is also a third and a very important reason, which is enriching his army. Um, how does Sisi basically guarantee his own safety and security from any future coups? It's by the fact that his senior brass have never had it that good in their entire lives. They are running the economy, they are running the state machine. There is a huge arsenal of laws that gives them immunity um, from prosecution or from any sort of accountability. And the new administrative capital, it's like in the center of this project. That's where the army is currently making billions out of these megalomaniac projects.
Can you talk a little bit about the displacement that has come out of building the new capital? Because I feel like that's something that often gets overlooked. I talked to, I talked to my parents and others about it, and they seem to be under the impression that people are just CC is building new housing, social housing for everyone. But you know, I, I'm skeptical.
There has been a couple of there had been like few projects that were announced in the media about social housing, and there is all sorts of propaganda video clips that have been produced by the regime in order to give that impression that they might be displacing people, but they are providing them with better housing. But this is bullshit. Let's talk about the facts. From 2013 onwards, CC has been engaged in restructuring the urban landscape in Egypt, militarizing and securitizing it. Also, there are historical parallels, even if they are not as ugly. For example, following the series of revolutions in France in the mid 19th century, Paris was demolished and rebuilt in a way so as to allow for the swift deployment of the troops in order to crush any popular unrest. There are historical precedents for this. Even during the 1990s war on terror, you have a city like Asyut, for example, which was, they dubbed it the capital of terrorism, but that's where the place where the Jama'a Islamiyya had a strong presence and witnessed many confrontations with the security forces. They also restructured the urban landscape in Asyut in order to militarize it and turn it into some heavily securitized urban landscape. Now, Sisi has been doing that since 2013. Uh, Part of the rationale is the swift deployment of the troops. Hence, you find all of those bridges, those wide roads that would allow the armored personnel carriers
Mm.
and the tanks to get deployed very quickly. But the other parts have to do with social control. Um, the state needs to have the population under constant surveillance. The state needs to have quick access when it comes to security deployments. Hence, and also the state needs to eradicate the poor slums of Cairo, which they regard as a social threat to the political order, and throw them outside on the outskirts. This is not a new policy. For example, Sadat, following the 1977 Bread Uprising in Tfatt al-Aish, um, did expel some of the slum dwellers in Cairo, like Turguman slum and few other slums. He basically threw them outside of the capital. Sisi has been doing the same, but on steroids. In one study, which also I quoted in my article, was conducted by anthropologist Omnia Khalil, who is currently based in the US, by the way. She concluded that at least 10% of the population of Cairo and Giza, or the so-called Greater Cairo, which also includes Qalyubiyya with them, have been displaced
Wow.
uh, in a decade after the coup. 10%. Um, this is a huge number, but this is something that Mubarak would not have dared to do. Um, because it's not because Mubarak was democratic, but Mubarak, there was an authoritarian formula. There was a give and take under Mubarak. He repressed with one hand, but on the other hand, he still opted for some form of domestic legitimacy. With Sisi, he is only accountable to his generals. He doesn't give a shit about the rest of the population. Um, so at this point in our history, by 2025, you have a regime that is very close to what a colonial occupation regime looks like. It's a regime that despises Egyptians. It's a regime that is that's living on expropriating and sucking the resources of the country. It is a regime that is isolated from the population. It is a regime that is effectively destroying and drying up any sources of wealth in society for short-term gains, not long-term projects. This is unfortunately the kind of reality that we live in Egypt today. But in my view, this is not a sustainable model.
Mhm.
Sisi is the victim of his own success. He managed to eradicate opposition, but at the same time, if an uprising happens spontaneously, there won't be an opposition that he can negotiate with in order to defuse the uprising, like in 2011, for example. Sisi might have angered and eaten up the wealth of sections of big capital in Egypt in order to satisfy his generals. But this means that on the long term, he will be left. I mean, it's not the long term. I mean, it's already a reality we're in today with a dysfunctional failed economy.
Yeah. So it does seem like there's some sort of like dialectical push and pull here where, they're
Exactly.
walling themselves off, but in doing that, they are creating the conditions, like you said, without the prospect of a politically acceptable mainstream opposition within the country. Um, if there is any sort of uprising, if the people do collectivize and decide they want to overthrow, it does seem like I mean, I don't know if I'm asking a leading question here, but what do you think would happen? Is it just going to be all out war between military and working class people, or what do you think would happen?
There will definitely be more bloodshed than what we saw in 2011 because the military and the security services will have so much to lose. Under Hosni Mubarak, it was only the senior brass who were basically prospering, but anyone below the rank of brigadier or below the rank of colonel were suffering in Egypt. Um, Hence, when the uprising took place in 2011, the military could not give orders to their officers to shoot the protesters because they knew that they would fracture the ranks. Now it's a very tricky situation. Again, we will only know when it happens, unfortunately. But some of those perks have been trickling down to the lower ranks. I mean, someone as junior as the rank of captain in the military intelligence can have so much connections and so much clout that the current regime, if it collapses, he would feel threatened, um, not really like relieved that it collapsed.
Mm.
So we will have to wait and see. But the thing that can give you hope a little bit is that the army and the police at the end of the day are still based on conscription, and they conscript mainly working class Egyptians and those from peasant backgrounds, but they also conscript parts of the Egyptian middle class at this point. And if an uprising takes place, I would say that it would be very difficult for those conscripts to open fire on the public. There will be some elite units, mainly in the special forces and in the paratroopers, and and few other branches that I think will put up a fight, but not the general army. Um, Again, I mean, I'm only speculating. It's very difficult to come up with very concrete scenarios
Yeah.
about what's going to happen. But what we can be assured of that this is not a resilient regime. Um,
Yeah.
this is not a regime that has roots in society. This is not a regime that has broad class alliance that can support it. I mean, Ahmed, remember that during the 18 days of the uprising against Hosni Mubarak, at some point, there was the so-called Battle of the Camel, uh, where the regime and the ruling National Democratic Party at the time sent in thugs and its
Yeah.
supporters to try to crush the sit-in in Tahrir. But, these are not just criminal paid thugs like the narrative goes. These are sections of Egyptian society who didn't want Hosni Mubarak to go. They felt that, they had interest in that regime. I don't see this happening with the current regime, except for the senior brass.
I just wanted to circle back a little bit. I was super interested that you mentioned that even before the Arab Spring, part of what kind of mobilized popular protest was support for Palestine. And just thinking in this moment, just about Sisi's position vis-a-vis kind of the U.S. and Israel versus like kind of popular support for Palestine. If you could talk a little bit about that and also talk about if there is any potential for mobilization around that issue.
There is, I mean, Palestine has always been the biggest politicizing and radicalizing factor for Egyptian youth. Um, I'm talking about myself. My gateway into politics had been my affinity or my solidarity with the Palestinians. And it's through the Palestinian cause that I started to get interest in changing my own regime.
Hmm.
And I'm not here a unique example. Most of the January 2011 revolution leaders, I mean, they came from the Palestine Solidarity movement originally, or started their political activism through the Palestinian cause. Now, with the ongoing genocide in Gaza, Egypt's streets are quiet. You don't see really much activism in it. There was a sudden burst of protests um, that happened briefly in October 2023, and this is really unprecedented. There were few other solidarity actions that took place in downtown Cairo in front of the press syndicate, but that's it. Um, and I mean, when you look back in time, let's say around the time that I got politically active in the late 1990s, it if someone was shot in Gaza, this was enough to have protests all across Egypt, and the university campuses and the professional syndicates and the mosques on Fridays. But this is not the case now, and you have a genocide, not just like some limited Israeli operation. And I know that this is puzzling and frustrating for many observers and activists outside Egypt, but you have to understand and appreciate the level of repression that exists in Egypt. Um, Spontaneous actions can always happen, and they do happen every now and then. But in order for these spontaneous actions to evolve, to develop into a movement, to start articulating demands, to start coordinating between the different spontaneous outbursts in different areas of Cairo and in different provinces, you have to have structures. You have to have organizations. You have to have political parties. You have to have youth groups. You have to have community organizations. And what this regime did intentionally and consciously since 2013 is dismantling the entire Egyptian civil society.
Hmm.
And I mean civil society here in the Gramscian sense, like any form of political institution in Egypt has been dismantled. Any institution that could mobilize Egyptians, even for apolitical reasons, like charities, like football fans associations, like anything that you can imagine, have been dismantled. That's why, Yasmin, that you do not see protests now in Egypt. Um, is this situation sustainable? I would say no.
Hmm.
Did the war on Gaza and the genocide and Sisi's complicity into these horrible crimes, did it affect the regime's legitimacy? I would say definitely yes. There are millions of Egyptians who are watching this genocide live on social media, and they are so frustrated and they feel so ashamed of their own regime and its role in the genocide. Now, we have to learn from history. Um, Outbursts and social uprisings and revolutions, they always happen, and they surprise everyone, including seasoned revolutionaries and seasoned activists. But there is always a long process of preconditions, a long process of dissent accumulating, a long process of frustrations with the current regime being accumulated, a long process of an incremental loss of political legitimacy in the eyes of the population. And I think that Gaza and the genocide in Gaza and Egypt's role in it is definitely accelerating this process, even if we don't see the outcome right away.
Hmm.
Once again, this is a regime that is highly repressive, but at the same time, it's the victim of its own success. Uh, it's because Sisi has wiped us all out that if a spontaneous uprising takes place, there won't be any reformists that can rush to save his own regime in exchange for some limited reforms or compromises.
Yeah, so let's kind of, I guess, talk a little bit more about all the different, including Palestine, the border with Sudan, right? So, because of the war between the RSF forces and the military, there have been a lot of displaced Sudanese refugees within and without Egypt. But what has been, Egypt and Sisi's reaction to that level of displacement?
Initially, the regime did not close down the borders, and there has been an influx of roughly of over 1 million Sudanese. I think three-quarters of a million of them have been registered as refugees with the UNHCR. But then, like few months into the war, Sisi started to tighten the borders, meaning you have continuous patrols from the border guard forces. Um, the entry of Sudanese men and their families into Egypt has become much more difficult, and it requires security permits, permits that would become or that would arrive very late or never. Hence, there was an increasing tide of irregular migration or irregular entry into Egypt, which the army had responded to by force, either shooting at the irregular migrants or holding them in military bases in really very horrible conditions. And there had been few investigative reports that came out recently on this. But also the Egyptian regime is trying to make money out of them. We have a new asylum law that has been enacted by the parliament. And on the one hand, they impose like financial sums of money on those refugees to pay in order to stay in the country, but also it takes away the mandate of the UNHCR and puts it within the hands of the Egyptian state institutions, which human rights activists and international organizations have condemned for its intrusiveness and for basically the crackdown on any form of rights that the refugees had. But simultaneously with this, the Egyptians have been receiving billions and billions from the European Union. And this money has been mainly going to the border guard forces and to the Navy in order to guarantee that there are no boats carrying irregular migrants that would leave Egypt to go into the shores of Europe. And and also to militarize our western border with Libya, which is another irregular migration route. Unfortunately, this has been the case, but and this goes really against the historical legacy of Egypt. Egypt has always been a place that hosts foreigners, that hosts persecuted refugees coming from all over the region. The relations between Egypt and Sudan has been very tight and close over the past centuries. There are many Egyptians and Sudanese who are intermarried. There are mixed families. Egyptians, especially in the south, could also trace their roots to cities in Sudan. And we had at least two presidents, Mohammed Naguib and Anwar Sadat, whose mothers were Sudanese. So it's really a shame that that we've come to this low point in our history where we are racially treating the Sudanese as inferiors.
Yeah, so I was wondering about that, right? So the posture of the Sisi regime and kind of the, them being used as a first line of defense for the rich European countries, as well as probably the Gulf Arab monarchies as well. That is clear, right? But I was actually wondering if you have any insight into how the Egyptian working class is feeling and whether that sentiment has changed over time, or whether there's a growing sense of nationalism that kind of manifests as like a anti-immigrant sentiment.
There is, I mean, we do read on Facebook and on other social media platforms of recent incidents happening here and there. And there is an Egyptian far-right trend who dub themselves as Abna Kemet. Kemet is it's like the old ancient Egyptian name for Egypt.
Mm.
And these guys are advocating some form of Egyptian nationalism, which is very similar to the far right and the fascist ideologies that you see in the West.
Right. Where the
Uh,
return to
yeah,
ancient Rome and Greece people. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And these guys have been inciting online campaigns against foreigners, mainly the Syrians and the Sudanese and Black Africans in general. How much of this is translated into campaigns on the ground? I would say very minimal.
Mm.
At least that's what's reported. It's very minimal. Um, but from the security services, I would say that definitely the Egyptian police is highly racist. If you are a Black African, you are likely to get stopped. While if you were a white European tourist, I mean, you will be treated as a god by the state authorities. But again, I don't think the situation is as bad as some people might think. There are still so many Egyptians whom I know, some of whom I know personally, who are involved in solidarity campaigns with those refugees, who have helped them to find housing, who have helped them to get access to services. And people sometimes forget that, many Egyptians themselves are blacks at the end of the day. I know that those sons of Kemet, the far right guys, they
Mm.
usually put these AI generated
Yeah.
pictures of pharaohs and Elizabeth Taylor being Cleopatra
Right.
and
Right.
all of this,
Yeah.
bullshit.
Y-
And but I mean, you live in the West,
Yeah.
I don't think that you as an Egyptian, if you arrive in Europe, you will be really treated in the same way.
No,
But
the really beautiful irony here is that all these guys who want to return to some sort of ancient empire is that, the borders of empires were always kind of porous and, not,
In so many ways, different people have come to Egypt. There's nothing to return to that is
yeah.
stable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But, okay. So I wanted to be conscious of your time here, but I wanted to also ask we talked a little bit about Egypt's, to what degree it's beholden to Western powers, and I kind of want to turn that to that now, right? Like I think we've set a good base in saying that there are a lot of things happening within Egypt that are the direct result of actions of the Sisi regime. I think in a lot of discussions, a lot of people want to see everything that's happening as a result of the West, which certainly it has a big and outsized effect on how poorer countries function. But I think to kind of say everything is happening because the U.S. is pulling strings or because Europe is pulling strings is perhaps a little bit of an oversimplification and erases some of the agency of people in the country. But
Exactly.
let's now, I guess, turn to that almighty power in the West, the U.S. How do you think Trump's second term is going to affect Sisi and Egypt at large?
It will be a moral boost, definitely, for Sisi, who is Trump's favorite dictator. Um, there will definitely be less of a rhetoric that the US usually makes about human rights and political reforms. But when it comes down to real business, there won't be really much change. The U.S. Foreign policy towards Egypt is run through the Pentagon, and few people in the U.S. understands that. It's the Pentagon that handles relations in Egypt, the U.S. relations when it comes to Egypt. The State Department are usually spectators and useless as always. And the White House, I mean, definitely has a contribution, but it is the American senior brass that holds the biggest sway when it comes to how to handle relations with Egypt. And there will be the same, I mean, business as usual.
Mm. Do you think Trump will apologize for calling Sisi the president of Mexico? Hey everyone, Ahmed here to say that I realized after the fact that it was in fact Joe Biden who called Abdel Fattah Sisi the president of Mexico. I guess I briefly got my geriatric statesman mixed up, but I think you'll just have to give me grace in my moment of sundowning, as it was actually sundown. In fact, it was 4 a.m. when we did this interview. So Hossam was very gracious about it. So enjoy the rest of the interview. Thanks. Bye.
I I don't think this would be really an issue, and Sisi is يعني راجل مهزأ يعني. I don't know how can I say that in English. He has zero self-respect when it comes to those foreign leaders. When you see him with those international backers, he's always like looking, he's having his face down, looking at the ground as if he was some obedient child. So I don't think that Sisi really cares about this. All what he cares about is the continuous flow of arms and continuous flow of money. And that will definitely be the case under Trump. There won't be much difference.
And can you actually just
But
add a little more to that
yeah,
for our listeners who aren't as familiar, just like the extent to which the U.S. militarily sort of funds Egypt?
Egypt receives $1.3 billion from your sweet taxpayers' money every year. And this goes to the Egyptian military. At some point in the past, the foreign aid to Egypt was roughly 2.1 or 2.2 billion. But it got cut down, but the military aid wasn't cut down. So the military aid has been steady since 1979 at 1.3 billion. This money is not sent in like in cash. This means access to US weapons. This means arms deals. This means money that goes into the maintenance of the US arms that Egypt had bought, and related items of expenses. But this 1.3 billion, I mean, when you think about it, it's not really much. It's not much, but it is a green light that this guy is ours. It is a public statement that this is our proxy. So under Mubarak, for example, when Omar Suleiman used to travel to Gaza or to Ramallah in order to pressure the Palestinians into concessions, Omar Suleiman was arriving as the second largest recipient of US foreign aid after Israel. This is a statement. So this means that I'm coming here as the US representative. The same goes also for Sisi. I mean, this 1.3 billion, it's not the end of the world, really. I mean, if the US cuts it, but it is a political statement. It is a statement about the Egyptian military and its role in the eyes of the Pentagon. And definitely this is not going to change at any time soon. But let's end on some positive note. I
Good
mean,
idea.
you live in the US, and the US is the biggest, if not one of the biggest, sponsors of the Egyptian regime. So this means that any form of pressure in the heart of the beast could exponentially have a greater impact back home in Egypt. This means that if you lobby your local elected representatives into holding the Egyptian regime accountable, or cutting the military aid, or pressuring them to pressure Sisi back into releasing some political prisoners, you have so much power that I don't see it used as frequently as you can. I know personally political prisoners whose torture either stopped in interrogation rooms or have been released thanks to outside pressure. I'm not implying here that the salvation of Egypt will come from Washington. I'm not implying here that that the US holds all the cards at the end of the day, because I would be denying agency for both. Agency for the criminal regime that is oppressing our fellow Egyptians, and the agency of our Egyptian opposition and Egyptian citizens in resisting this tyranny. But you have also so much power in the US that you should also put to good use.
Yeah, I think that definitely applies in not only Egypt, but continuation of resistance on behalf of, Palestinians, but everywhere that the U.S. empire is involved. But Hossam El Hamalawy, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through all these different aspects, and we really, really, really appreciate it. Can you just quickly tell the audience where, again, to find your work and what you're working on?
And we'll also link it in the show notes so people can go directly there too.
Definitely.
Thanks, Ahmed, and thanks, Yasmin. It was really a pleasure being on your show, and I hope that we speak again in better circumstances, I hope, for our country. Your audience, I would be honored if they check out my work on Substack. I have a newsletter which I publish weekly on Egyptian politics. And I do contribute to other platforms every now and then, like Middle East Eye, and to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation here in Germany, where I'm currently based at the time. Yeah, I mean, that's mainly it. And I've left Twitter actually recently, or X, but I'm on Blue Sky, the alternative to Twitter. I can't put up with Elon Musk any longer.
Speaking of our local ridiculous autocrats, yeah.
So you can find my work over there.
Wonderful. All right. Thanks again, and we'll hopefully talk to you later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
غير كل خرايط الكون، غير مواعيد وساعات اليوم. هزني هزني من جوه، هز بقوة. غير ترتيب أيام الشهر، غير ألوان السما والبحر. كسر أصنامي، علمنا أتمرد على أوهامي. علمني أصبر على يأسي وعلى أحزاني، واهرب من الخوف وأحب. هزني هزني من جوه، هز بقوة. كنا صغار وكبرنا، رحنا مدارس وتعلمنا ازاي نتستر على مشاعرنا، زي أسير هربان من حكم بالإعدام. قضبان وراها قضبان، وحدان حواليها حيطان. احنا السجين واحنا السجان، وحياتنا عيب وحرام وغلط وكلام وكلام